In Toledo, we saw your Greenwood Corvette Sebring 75 when it was in progress. To see all that brass, you showed us your working front suspension. Pardon the pun, but you've crossed that finish line. What you've shown me looks awesome.
Well, thank you. I just begun the build about a year and a half before. Got wrapped up here about a week and a half ago.
Can you tell us a little bit about your inspiration? I mean, why you picked this car over so many of the other, major Corvettes of that era?
Sure. Well, this particular car is the first Greenwood wide body. That refers to the extra large flares to cover the extra large tires underneath it. And this was their development car, and they spent several years actually racing this car in slightly different configurations. I first saw this car in the summer of 1975 when it was competing at Road America in Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. It was in a little bit different livery for that race weekend, but it was the same car. And maybe some people would argue this, but I don't know how you can see a big black Corvette in action on the racetrack and not be affected by that. It's just something that has stuck with me all these years, and I decided to add this to the large-scale build list. With all my projects, I like to do a lot of research. In fact, I consider that a lot of the fun of the project. It used to be a lot more challenging before the internet. It's a little easier now. With a scale project of this magnitude, I have to have a lot of research information to really do it correctly.
Now, you really did an amazing job. You even traveled overseas and spent some time with the actual car.
Yes, this one all came together after a conversation with another model builder from the East Coast, Jan Hyde, who's also a Corvette aficionado and a Corvette vintage racer. He had some contacts as to where the car was, who owned it. The car was over in France, and it was at a race shop near the Paul Ricard Formula One circuit in the south of France. And I thought, well, perhaps someday I could get there and photograph this. Well, the next spring, 2018, my work took me to Munich, Germany. It's a whole lot closer to France than Dayton, Ohio. And that's how it all came together. I spent 2 days going over the car, photographing it, making measurements, making drawings, took over 1,000 photos of it, made dozens of sketches, and took hundreds of measurements so that I had it properly documented. Of course, as I got into the build, I realized just how little information I really had, even with all of that. And you end up then continuing your research as the build progresses.
Wow, you must have been so psyched when you got back home. Did you get right to work?
Yeah, some of the drawings started then. The build itself didn't start until December of that year. With projects of this nature, after the research, I don't start actually putting pieces together until I've made some of the basic drawings that I feel are necessary. Usually it's a top view and side view of the chassis, showing where the wheels are going to be located, track width, wheelbase, where the engine is located, all the major components, so that I know they're going to fit and know that they're going to represent the prototype that I documented.
So you have all this information. Is the next step then saying, okay, what parts already exist? And I don't see a lot of kit parts here.
I had been planning it for a little while, and along the years I had collected a monogram 67 Corvette, which is actually the C2 versus this being the C3, but the frame rails are the same. So I figured I could use that for the stock frame rails. For the body panels, I knew I had to start with something. I didn't really figure I'd want to scratch build all those Corvette panels, although there had to be a lot of modification. And I had a Toyota 1/12 scale 1978 Corvette. So it had the basket handle hatchback body style, similar to this one, which is actually a 1974 C3. So I had to backdate it. Things like the Roadster roof panel had to be scratch built to represent the 74 car instead of the 78 car. The fender flares and all that sort of thing were added later to represent the one-to-one. I knew going in that there would be very few kit pieces used in the build. Basic stock frame rails were used for the chassis. The original Corvette body panels were used as the basis for the bodywork. Body panels, I use a fabrication technique where I basically just add sheet plastic to the exterior of the kit body to form the flares, and then try to limit how much putty is used because I worry about it cracking and changing over time. The fender flares were just added with the sheet plastic and then blended in and formed. Same with that rear spoiler. Even the roof was originally modified using sheet styrene. The air dam on the front of the car is brass because it had to be a little bit stronger and thinner to be prototypically correct. In the case of the hood, it was more or less a stock hood, but the power bulge had to be raised a couple of scale inches to clear that intake system nonetheless. And so for the hood and the roof, I ended up resin casting both of those, which gave me some spares to work for painting practice and decal practice and things like that. But it also gave me a homogeneous, consistent part that I didn't have to worry about it cracking or splitting over time. The hood and the roof were kind of unique because of their thin nature, and they were very fragile in their modified state. I went ahead and spent the time to make RTV molds of those and cast those in resin so that I'd have a nice, consistent, homogeneous part to work with, that I didn't have to worry about it cracking or splitting down the road.
Yeah, so you're considering overall the archival quality of the build.
I try to. You spend this much time working on it, building it, you'd like it to last a few years. And there's never any guarantees, as we know. Everything else was either scratch built, or in the case of this car, it has a very unique intake system, Kinsler cross ram manifold. I was not exactly looking forward to scratch building that, but of course, if I had to, I had to. I came across Shapeways site that does 3D printing. And not only did they have the Muncie transmission that I needed, but also the bell housing, the big block engine, and that unique manifold. So those are 3D printed parts that I was able to purchase from Shapeways. They needed a lot of work because of the roughness of the printing. They, I think in the end, did save some time over having to scratch build all those components.
Sure, they gave you just a great foundation to start and then do your magic and your great detailing on top. Can you give us a run through on the engine? Stacks with the screens on them that are really, really nice with the little bowl shape in the screen.
Yeah. Yes, the printed texture of most of the engine parts worked out very well for like a cast aluminum block or a cast bell housing or transmission housing. But for the manifold, while that is a casting, it's a very smooth casting. And the 3D printed part was a bit rough because of the resolution of the printing. So that one took a lot of fill and primer and more filling and more primering and smoothing, and finally got it to where I liked it. The intake trumpets themselves are flared aluminum tubing. I created a flaring tool to use on the lathe. It's basically a spherical ball end, and also utilized cutting fluid as a lubricant there, which really helped the forming process of that flare. I was able to get them very consistent and very smooth. The screen was just stainless steel mesh pushed down into a spherical depression with another ball end tool, and then cut out and fixed to the end of those trumpets. Linkages are primarily scratch built out of brass rod with a lot of RB motion help on heim joint ends and things of that nature. Also, I figured out that his Formula One Cosworth engine fuel injectors were a pretty good match for what was on this car. So I used a set of those to create the injectors for that intake manifold. The clear fuel lines are actually stretchable tubing that comes from Orvis, which is a company that makes supplies for fishermen who do their own fly tying. And they have several different diameters and colors of very flexible, very thin wall tubing that worked out just really perfect for those fuel lines on that injector manifold.
That's amazing. Wonderful solution.
Yep, check them out. They have a few products that us model builders can use. Just no end to what you might find.
It's all out there. We just have to go do the research, and that's the fun part.
I spend as much time in hardware stores, craft stores, sewing stores, fabric stores looking for materials. The window net, for example, on the driver's side, after spending a bit of time looking at all the different netting that was available commercially, I discovered that I just wasn't going to find what I was looking for. So I ended up making a template, a loom, so to speak, basically wove it out of individual threads and then joined at each crossover point with a little dot of adhesive to hold them together, and then banded it with athletic tape to give it the band around the edge. Another similar thing is the screens on the rear fender. While that looks like screen, it is, but it's actually a piece of ribbon that's just very open mesh. Found that around Christmas time at one of the craft stores.
Just all those discoveries when you don't expect it coming.
You get a treasure hunt every so often, and you might be successful or you might not.
For the Billboard Goodyears, what system did you use to replicate those slightly raised letters?
On these tires, what I ended up doing was making a master of a sidewall, just a smooth sidewall contour. It stops at the shoulder of the tire, so it's a very thin piece. And then I made RTV molds of a front tire and a rear tire sidewall. Then I took those to a gentleman that I've worked with before who has a laser engraver and created the Goodyear lettering, all the other tire size lettering, and the for racing purposes only warnings on the side of the tire. Duplicated that in Photoshop, then laser engraved that into the molds in mirror image. So then when you pour the resin in the mold and you pull it out, you have raised letter tires. So then those two sidewalls get joined to a tread ring, and the tread ring in this case is a slick, but it has a bit of a crown shape to it, and it also has the tread wear indicators engraved into it. And those I just engraved using the lathe and a very small bit to cut those into the tire. So then you take two sidewalls and a tread ring, you glue them together, and now you've got the tire. In this case, with it being a road racing tire, usually those tires, we consider them smooth, but if you look at them close, there's quite a bit of texture to that tread surface, and it has to do with the stickiness of the tire and what it picks up off of the track. So to replicate that, I masked off the sidewalls and sprayed the tread surface with a textured paint that replicated the worn hot rubber surface of the tire.
I sense that you do whatever you can in-house for your own building pleasure. I assume the electroplating you did?
Yep, it's actually electroless cobalt nickel, the Caswell plating system. I recommend that system, very easy to use and great result. Use that for suspension pieces, exhaust header collectors and dump pipes, those sort of things, the windshield wiper, those all have the cobalt nickel plating. But yeah, back to your original question, I do try to do so much of this myself that I enjoy stretching my capabilities and trying some new techniques. This model gave me the option of learning how to do a little bit more with graphics, with all the Sebring 75 graphics and the American flag on the hood, worked those up in a software program, made my own water slide decals, made my own dry transfers. Where I don't want a decal film to show, I'll use the dry transfer system. So all the contingency decals on the rear quarter panel, those are all water slide decals, whereas the Goodyear on the roof and the Sebring on the side of the car are dry transfers, so you don't have a clear decal film showing around those.
Did you overcoat those dry transfers at all?
Yeah, not on the model. The dry transfer kit has a clear decal film that you laminate to the image itself before you apply it, and that gives it the right sheen to look like a vinyl decal on the full-size car. I also learned on this project that by using that same film on top of laser printed water slide decals gives them a lot better appearance and makes them just a little bit more robust for installing them. They don't crack as readily and they lay down a whole lot nicer.
It's a great solution. Very successful.
And of course, hand painted lettering on a race car, not clear coated over it, doesn't have a decal film, doesn't have a carrier. So the dry transfers gave me that effect. And on this model as well, even though it was mid-70s, most of the graphics, the numbers on the side, the Sebring logos are all still hand painted on the car.
That was an era of very artistic body painting on a car.
Yeah, in a way, I was fortunate that this didn't have crazier graphics, because then I would have really been challenged.
Oh, I think it was quite a challenge, and you pulled it off so well. Are you using different brands or different types of paint? Do you have a preference?
Painting is probably my weakest area. Where many builders will be painting a model maybe once every couple of weeks, once a month, I'm painting a model about every 5 years. I don't get much practice. But for this car, I knew that I did not want to clear coat it, didn't want to need to clear coat it because of trying to keep it true to the prototype. For the primer, I use a Duplicolor product called Bright Touch. Fine gray primer, a really nice choice without having to spend big money on a hobby primer. So that's what I used for all the body work. Then prior to painting, I laid on a few coats of Tamiya white primer because it's very fine. It almost is as smooth as a base coat white as far as I can tell. And then that was wet sanded with 3200 to level it out. And then I actually just sprayed all the body components with the Tamiya pure white lacquer spray paint right out of the can. I didn't decant it. With the 12 scale body parts, they're large enough that you can get by with that. And you don't have to worry about too much buildup in corners and things. And so I just kept it simple. And then after it was all cured, rubbed it out using the polishing kit. And this is what you see.
The seat upholstery, what materials did you use to get all that great tuck and roll and character that upholstery has?
I took a page out of Jim Drew's playbook and used some of the two-part epoxy putty. So I had a basic seat form that I had vacuum formed out of styrene. I then took a flat sheet of plastic and rolled out a thin sheet of the two-part epoxy putty. Then to create the stitching, the diamond pattern or the straight pattern, whichever part of the seat it was, I took the finest blade razor saw I had and just pressed it into the putty at regular intervals to create the pattern. So the teeth on the fine razor saw blade created what looks like the stitching, and the blade itself did the indentation for the seam. So then once those were cured, I cut them out and basically just glued them to that vacuum form seat form to create the seat cover itself. It was all painted with a black shoe dye because I find that gives a more realistic appearance of leather or Naugahyde vinyl than a regular black paint would.
It's so realistic.
Well, thank you.
When you did that, was it first tried, one seat and you're done? Was it a home run the first time?
Well, it was at least a triple, let's say. I did a little bit of practicing with just some spare pieces of plastic and some of the epoxy putty just to test the concept. All came together on the first try for the seat cover itself, but you're not far off from so many other aspects of the model. I have boxes and boxes of parts from this build where it didn't come together on the first try or the second or maybe even the third before I got the results I wanted. That's another one of my modeling philosophies, I guess you'd call it, the ability to be honest enough with myself that even though I've spent maybe hours building a part, if I know deep down I'm not happy with the result, I'm willing to set it aside and start over again. Most often the second or third try will end up a whole lot better because just of the practice. That's the other way that I try to improve the models as I build them.
And I sense in doing that you don't find that frustrating. You find the joy in going to the next step to see if you can get the next one better.
Before I really embraced that concept, it was frustrating because, again, you'd spend hours on something. I got it done finally. I know it's not perfect, but it's done. But then you'd convince yourself, no, this has to be fixed. And actually, in the early days, my wife was the best critic. She was honest enough to go, yeah, that's probably not as good as you really want it to be. And so I was able to grow from that and just learn that sometimes you got to build it multiple times before you get the results you want.
One thing I greatly admire about your workflow when you build is you seem to have an attitude where that part doesn't exist and no one's ever made it like that before, but I want that tire tread or I want that particular texture, and you go to great lengths to make sure that you've replicated the part and that you have it exact. The whole of the model comes together because of that.
Well, thank you, Doug. And yeah, it's part of the philosophy that I had to adopt on these extended projects that take years to finish. I try to think of each component as a model in and of itself. And that really brings two benefits. One, as you noted, it all comes together as a whole lot better end product because each piece is as good of a model of whatever that component is that I can make, but it also allows a little bit of sense of satisfaction. Oh, hey, I completed something. I now have a model of the engine, or I have a model of the wheel. It does allow for a little bit of an accomplishment along the way. There's the underside. So fuel cell, differential cooler, pump for the differential cooler, the oil tank and back, the fiberglass belly pan, the very unique headers and collectors on this car, the oil lines and system, the transmission linkage, front suspension, front brake cooling ducts, and all the radiator ducting. So very busy chassis and underneath on this car. Lots of components that I probably didn't fully appreciate when I started, but ended up having to make them all to make it accurate. Posable steering.
Posable, cool. Of course.
Yep, you got to have that, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how much detail even goes into the chassis.
The door hinges on this were made out of brass. The doors themselves have pockets in them to slide over those brass hinges so that they can be adjusted and aligned after they're installed.
Can you show us a bit on the interior?
And the gauges are all photo reduced from photos taken of the full-size car gauges. I did have a photographer friend who had Photoshop capability. He took the basic images and cleaned them up for me a little bit so that then I could size them correctly and print them. The rest of the interior, there's a lot of aluminum in this car, as you can see. Aluminum tunnel, all these panels in the back. There's really a lot of sheet aluminum in this car. And that was another technique that I had to master for this. I went to the local Dollar Tree store and bought a number of the aluminum baking pans and found one that worked out very well for embossing. I create a template that gives me the bead rolling pattern. It's a groove that gets engraved into a base plate of sheet plastic. Then lay the aluminum over that and emboss it down into that groove, and that makes the bead rolling.
On those aluminum panels, the one thing I noticed that is really cool, you have weld beads and you have rivets. It goes beyond just, the baking pan. You just took it to that next level.
The weld beads were a necessity because in the prototype car, that transmission tunnel was a fabricated assembly of a lot of little pieces. To duplicate those, once I had the aluminum tunnel fabricated in the same manner in scale, I sliced very narrow strips of aluminum furnace tape, laid them down over the seams, and then pressed into them with a toothpick, more or less, at a regular interval to create the weld bead itself. The rivets all over those aluminum panels are another Jim Drew special effect. One of his modeling tips from way long ago, using the Pentel pencil as a punch. You sharpen the end of the sheath that goes around the lead and use that as the punch to punch out little dots of the aluminum furnace tape, and then use the lead and advance it to push the rivet head out of the end of the pencil and onto the panel.
And that's a 1/12 scale Pentel pen.
Well, it would be, yes. They make those clear down to 0.3 millimeters. And 0.3 millimeters is about the right size for a 24 scale even. So
I have to stock up on those. That's a great tip. Got to thank Jim for that one.
Oh, yes. Jim has a lot of good ideas. That one, I think, on my list anyway, is his best one ever.
I'm thinking of you as an artist in choosing this car to replicate. In comparison, a Porsche 911, which had flared fenders and was, a cool looking car. This canvas, unlike the 911, allows you to really show well engine detail where it's very buried on a Porsche. The chassis of the car is pretty smooth on the bottom on a 911, and this just has a lot of character. I think it's a wonderful canvas.
Well, thank you. Again, trying to keep it accurate to the prototype. All the body panels on the model are removable with the exception of the doors. The front fender all comes off. Two fenders and the nose are all one piece, and the rear fenders, deck lid, and rear bumper are all one piece. Those are held on with small replicated fasteners to look like the Zeus fasteners and the bolts that they used to hold it on the real car. So those come off. Then also all those aluminum panels underneath come off as well. So this can be stripped back down to the basic chassis assembly. Wheels and tires are removable with 5 lug nuts, just like on the full-size car. Again, try to replicate as best I can the full-size car that I'm replicating.
So when you show this, at one point during the day, will you pull those body panels off? Give people a preview at some point of what's underneath?
I think that would be my plan. Start out with displaying it with everything in place, and then through the course of the day, take off, as I have now, the hood, the roof, open the doors, take off some wheels and tires, and eventually the fenders would come off and those aluminum panels. So I think that would be the way to get it all on display during the course of the event.
I can't wait to see this out at the shows. I'm sure you're going to take it and show it as soon as you can.
Well, certainly, my intention is to be at the final GSL. I'd like to get down to Atlanta, like to get back out to NNL East, maybe NNL West. I always wanted to go to that show, never been there. I'd like to get it out and show it to the people and get some feedback.
What's on your bench now? I've always remembered and always loved your Cannon truck, that's 24th scale or 25th.
Yep, the Hugo Zucchini human cannonball truck that I saw at the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus World Museum in Wisconsin decades ago, and that was built at the time. Oddly that you mentioned that, because what's on the bench right now is a 1927 Mack Bulldog AC truck. It was the water truck for the Ringling Brothers Circus. Been on the list for over 30 years. Now it's time to just have some fun and do something a little easier.
All these great techniques from this build are gonna fall in place now on that one.
Yes. We'll use some of them again. Certainly the lessons learned on the decals and things will be applied. And hopefully I can learn something new on this one too, because another reason for doing some of these builds is just to continue to add to the skill set and learn more techniques.